Our next speaker is going to be on Zoom because she is in Jordan. And Doug and I have just talked to her, and she's waiting to appear on the screen. She's a doctoral student at Andrews University, although since she's in dissertation phase, she's able to be at home because although she has worked with the Department of Antiquities of Jordan, she's now back being a full-time mom and wife as she does her work. The reason that she's on to talk about her dad's experience is that when we finished our work at Heshbon, or Tel Hesban, our team moved to a new site called Umeri. We had wanted to work at the largest site in central Jordan called Jalul, but at first we got the permit, then there were some political complications, and they said, why don't you go on to Umeri, and eventually you'll be able to come back. So while we were working at Umeri, we got a permit to work at Jalul. And we asked Randy Yonker, who at that time was a doctoral student, to be our director at the site of Jalul while most of us worked at Umeri. And I helped negotiate the permit from the local, who we thought was the right person, to get a permit to work at the site. It was a sheikh who lived on the side of the mountain, and everybody said he was the one to talk to. And he said, surely, gave us a permit. We can dig up the top. Of course, we had the government permit, but we had to have the local permit as well. And the day that we started to work, a Mercedes, a black Mercedes, came rushing up onto the mountain. None of us had ever driven up on top before. He came rushing right up to the top, got out, a general with a uniform. He said, why are you working at this site? Well, we told him about the permit. We showed him the government permit. We told him that we had talked to the sheikh. He said, none of that matters. I'm the one who gives you permit. This is my land. The lady who is going to be talking to you is the daughter of that general who came rushing up onto the mountain. And he is related to the tribe that found the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's going to be fun to listen to her account from her family's perspective. So now that if everything works, we're going to switch to the next speaker.
Dear friends and colleagues, it's a pleasure to join you at the 2023 Archaeology Discovery Weekend. I would like to begin by thanking the Center of Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University for their efforts in making this happen. And I present to you now the discovery of Qumran Cave 1 by my father, Lieutenant General Akash Zaben. My country, Jordan, is full of historical and archaeological treasures that have captured the imagination of archaeologists, historians, and public for decades. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 in the area of Qumran, on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. After being there for nearly 1,000 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls are considered to many to be one of the most significant discoveries in the 20th century. However, as with many great discoveries in the last century, there have been many historical falsehoods regarding how they came out. A narrative was adopted by some that these scrolls were found unexpectedly and randomly by Bedouins roaming in the area. However, context is key. The fact of the matter is that the Bedouins knew what they were doing by searching the caves in the surrounding area and tricked people who asked them about the place by not telling them from where they found the scrolls. However, at that time, the Jordanian armed forces were the ones that played a key role in locating the caves where the scrolls resided. This is where the story of my father, General Lieutenant Akash Zaben, and his relationship to the Dead Sea Scrolls began. Before we get into the actual discovery of the scrolls, I would like to give a brief background of my father, Akash Zaben. Akash Zaben was born in 1928 in the village of Jalul. He received his education in Amman and joined the Jordanian Armed Forces in 1943. He received his military education at the Staff Military College, Camberley, in the United Kingdom, and participated in all battles fought by the Jordanian Armed Forces from 1948 to mid-60s. He was appointed as an aide-de-camp to His Majesty King Abdullah I, the founder. This was followed by a distinguished military career, who he served as the commander of the Royal Armed Corps, commander of the Southern Region, and senior military advisor and chief aide-de-camp to His Majesty King Hussein, director of the Ministry of Military Operation, and ending with his position as a deputy Joint Chief of Staff of the Jordanian Armed Force. Following his retirement from the military, he was appointed as a Jordanian ambassador to many countries. And in 1970, he was appointed as Jordanian Minister of Defense. Now, you may ask, how come does a military man in Jordan happen to discover the Dead Sea Scrolls? He was neither a historian nor an archaeologist. That's where the story becomes interesting, and I hope you all will come to enjoy it. In the year 1949, my father was a captain in the Arab army, serving in King Talal's brigade in the area of Bitomia near Ramallah, Palestine. Information had received by Lash Pasha, the commander of the 3rd Battalion, about a Belgian officer who had been working as observer at the United Nations. This officer had been looking for the scrolls and ancient ruins with the assistance of Mr. Lancaster Harding, Jordan's director of antiquities at that time, alongside a Bedouin man. They surveyed the area for 7 days, but found nothing to indicate that the cave site was near. As a result, they asked for help from Lash Pasha, who proceeded to ask my father to carry out the survey to find the caves containing the scrolls. Akash, known for his exceptional ability to read maps and understand them, he was able to identify potential sites. He searched for caves in these sites and then focused on 3 locations. The first location was Khan al-Ahmar in East Jerusalem. However, despite a thorough search, he did not find anything in that location. He then moved on to the second site, in the area of Nabi Musa, which has yielded no results. However, he did not lose hope of finding what he was looking for. The third and final location was the Dead Sea, where he found a desolated old village named Khirbat Qumran on his map. The village's discovery gave my father a renewed sense of confidence, and he was sure that the caves were in that village. His determination was clear, and he was driven by his desire to succeed and a sense of patriotism and belonging to the land. He always used to tell me about his love for the soil of his nation, which is full of blessing and filled with the wells of civilization past, which, according to him, motivated him to search with vigor. Looking towards Khirbat Qumran, with what he called his Bedouin keenness and excitement, he climbed mountains and began to look for any ancient traces inside the caves within his path. He explored Khirbat Qumran for 7 days until his attention was drawn to some broken pottery and scattered cloth in front of the caves, or rather a crack. This is what he used to tell me, it's a crack. He immediately collected the items and informed Lash Pasha of his findings. He expressed his firm belief that the crack contains the scrolls they were looking for. When Mr. Harding and the brigade commander visited my father at the site, Mr. Harding did not believe that what my father found was substantial, because it was not a cave. Yet, the pottery and cloth found was an unusual discovery in my father's opinion. He theorized that a group attempted to dig up the contents inside the crack. He also said that if the scrolls were put in a cave, then they would have fallen to theft a long time ago. My father pointed out it is not possible for a man to enter this crack unless he crawls in his stomach. He insisted on his hypothesis and entered the crack crawling. He brought out the contents inside the cave, and to everyone's surprise, my father pulled out the scrolls. Mr. Harding took the pottery pieces and scrolls to study them in Amman. The following day, he thanked my father and confirmed what my father had known all along, what was found were in fact the Dead Sea Scrolls, 2,000 years old at the time, and one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century. Akash was filled with great joy. He was surprised to find such cultural heritage. He recognized that he was standing on the land that has seen all ages and historical eras. He said that he loved the soil of his homeland even more for underlying treasures. Following the discovery, and in 1952, Mr. Harding, the Lash Pasha, and a group of archaeologists from Amman carried out research and explored the location. They found 5 other scrolls and discovered 11 caves in 1956. The discovery of this treasure received great interest from scholars and specialists all around the world. My father once said that Jordan is an open museum that God has endowed with wide civilization. He believed that there must be a collective sense of awareness and belonging within our people to the archaeological treasures of Jordan. Unfortunately, despite being interviewed by many news outlets, both domestic and international, the story of Akash Zaben roles in the discovery of Dead Sea Scrolls were forgotten with time, and then attributed the discovery to a group of Bedouins. However, knowing my father, he would not have cared for the attention, nor the fame, nor the money that may have accompanied the coverage of his role. Instead, he would say that what is important and what has always been important is that he was able to show the world that Jordan is special, and the benefits of such discovery must be enjoyed in their entirety by Jordan and the Jordanian people. That's the story about how a military man came to play a crucial role in history, and for a brief period of time was able to become one of the most successful archaeologists in history, even though he was unknown by many. My father's story, as you imagine, has had a profound impact on me. In Arabic, we say the term bint abuha, or her father's daughter, when translated to English. It is a term used in our culture when girls' characteristics and interests closely resembles those of her father. My father's love for Jordan hidden treasures and its soil were deeply ingrained in me. From a young age, I have always wished to follow in my father's footsteps and started my own journey of discovery into my ancestors' land of Tel Jalul. And I do hope, really, I do hope to find such treasures in this land one day, and I am excited to see what lies ahead. Thank you.
Well, Sabal, I don't know if you can hear me, but we appreciate you sharing your story so much. And in our discussion, in our little group now, maybe we'll have a chance to integrate what she's just told us and see how that matches what our specialist will have to say. I want to invite our speakers to come up to the front here, and also 2 other scholars that we've invited to join us. We're going to have a little discussion among ourselves, and then we're going to open it to questions on your part. So let's rearrange the platform. Sabal, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Sabal, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can see you on the screen. What time is it for you in Jordan?
Now it's 4:26, 4 o'clock morning.
In the morning?
Yeah,
Oh,
4:26.
4 in the morning. Well, we thank you for being willing to stay up so late or to get up so early for us. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Actually, I
Thank you.
didn't sleep. I thought I might miss it, that's why.
It's great to see you. We wish you could be here in person, but if you could stay online, we would appreciate that. So let me introduce the other people on the platform right now. And let's start with Dr. Medina on this. Can you, do we have a microphone? Let me take this over here. So introduce yourself, Dr. Medina, and tell us about where you teach and what your specialty is.
Yes, well, I'm Richard Medina. I am Seventh-day Adventist. I did my PhD in Jerusalem, and Emmanuel Tofa was one of my professors there. And I've been teaching at the University of California, Santa Barbara since September last year. And my field is the language of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I wrote my dissertation in Hebrew on the syntax of the Hebrew text from Qumran. So I'm very happy that we have this opportunity that we talk about this topic that is close to my heart to a large audience.
Great. Thank you so much. Good. Now, the next two individuals have been introduced, so you know who they are. Briefly introduce yourself, and you'll get a more extensive one tomorrow.
Thank you. Hi there. My name is Alex Jason. I'm a professor at New York University, and I teach on, surprise, surprise, the Dead Sea Scrolls in ancient Judaism. So,
thank you. Good. Does that work for you?
I think so, yes.
Okay, good.
I'm Sydney White Crawford from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and Princeton Theological Seminary, and I work on the Dead Sea Scrolls.
I'm Ken Bramlett. I teach archaeology here on campus, and that includes a little bit of Qumran archaeology, but I defer to Jody Magnus.
Dr. Bramlett was not on the program because he was supposed to be leading a tour of Israel right now. And the only benefit to that is that I was supposed to take his classes, and so I don't have to do that. And he's here in person, so we're glad that he's a part of the panel. Let's start by asking any of these specialists how they can integrate the story that you've just heard with what the general history of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is.
Well, I think I had known that there was a Jordanian army unit that was involved in the search for Cave 1. And so I'm very glad to hear from Sabal about her father's role in that.
Mm-hmm. So evidently, after the discovery by the Bedouin, they wanted to know where these came from, and so they asked the army to get involved. Lancaster Harding was the director of the Department of Antiquities in Jordan at that time, so he was involved. And evidently, they did find the place where at least some of the caves were. Is that right? Had you heard this story before?
So actually, one of the new pieces of information for me was the fact that he made 3 tries in 3 different places before he actually found the site at Qumran. Yeah. But that was, and then he was going to give up, right? But so the 3rd time was a charm.
Yeah. Let me ask Kent at the other end what your reaction is to what you've heard this morning. Any comments that you have, questions that you have of our speakers?
Yeah, well, I do have a couple. I would like to ask Jody about her, the evidence, the line of reasoning that leads you to suggest the faunal deposits in those pottery vessels are from a sacrificial program down there.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I did publish this as a very long article in the Journal of Ancient Judaism a few years ago. I can't remember what year it was that it came out, but maybe it was 2018 or 2019. And I also have it in my second edition of my Qumran book. So, it was kind of the outgrowth of a paper topic that I gave to a graduate student to write for a class, and kind of took off from there. And as a result, I realized that we had been looking, as I said in the lecture, we had been looking for parallels in all the wrong places. But the fact is that when you actually open up excavation reports of sanctuary sites with temples, and then you open up DeVoe's report, his final report with the pictures and with the text, and you compare them side by side, it's identical. There's just no doubt about it. So, I mean, I'm completely convinced. As I say, a lot of my colleagues have problems wrapping their heads around this possibility. To me, it suggests that the interpretation in this case of, you know, the sort of ritual meal thing, and it's not animal bone deposits, it couldn't be sacrifices, is overly influenced by our modern concept of what ancient Judaism was. We, in fact, know that there were other sacrificial cults to the God of Israel, including at Leontopolis in Egypt, and, you know, of course, there was the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. And so anyway, there certainly were other examples of this, but I think that this kind of Deuteronomistic mindset that modern scholars have has precluded that as a possibility. But again, I think that I'm an archaeologist coming from the archaeological side. I just think that it's the evidence is unequivocal. The textual evidence with regard to passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I also discuss in the JAJ article, it's all over the place. I mean, there are passages that would seem to support that, passages that seem to, and by the way, Frank Cross was one of the people who actually did think that these were sacrificial remains. He's one of those who did think that. I'm sorry he's not still alive so that I could have had a supporter, you know. But anyway, yeah.
Go ahead and ask your question now.
I have a question to my left side neighbor. I was thrilled by many of the things you said, and I want to talk a little bit and ask questions about the places where the Qumran inhabitants were actually living, sleeping, dwelling. First of all, I remember a research by Magen Broshi, who wrote a study because we don't know how many people live there. And so he took the measures of the large eating area and so many square meters. And then he compared this, he looked at studies of American jails. And then he said, well, in American jails, so many people can be together in one large room. And by comparing the Qumran area with those jails, I think he came up with the figure of 150 people. So he said there probably were 150 people who inhabited in each generation together. But now my question to you, and I've been thinking about this all along. I don't know all the literature about this, where they were sleeping, but I remember that in the last, one of the last excavations, I think by Broshi and Eschel, they found remnants of tents, or what they consider to be remnants of tents. I don't know what is a remnant of a tent. But in any event, so my major question is actually, not an archaeologist, but I find it a strange idea if you plan a settlement like this, with so many very specialized rooms for such, dedicated people who give their life to God, and not to think where would they sleep. I don't think the idea of them sleeping in the second floor is very attractive. But so my question is, isn't it strange not to sweep over in your own settlement? Because you as an archaeologist may have something to say about that. You know, other settlements, maybe they're not communities.
Wow, Emmanuel, that's a lot to talk about. And okay.
We're sure you could take
can
15 minutes, but don't take that long.
Gosh, where do I even start? So you're right. Magain Broshi is the one who gave that estimate of 100 to 150 people based on how many people he estimated could fit into the communal dining room assembly hall. So that's the number that I go with, although, I mean, I would qualify and say that I absolutely do not think that the population was stable. I think that it fluctuated. It probably, I mean, it fluctuated. I don't know if it was daily or monthly or whatever, but I mean, it was not a stable population. As far as the character of the community goes, and you're right, that Magain Broshi and Hanan Eshel excavated what they called residential caves in the Marol Terrace, on which Qumran sits, and there undoubtedly were other caves like that that simply have not been found because the marl is very friable and it collapses easily, so there must be more of those. And so they were able to identify those as residential caves. The tents that you mentioned were actually, they did report on that, but that was something where they called in another Israeli archaeologist, Uzi Avner, who works in the area of Eilat and who's well known for his work in desert environments. And he was the one who identified what looked like remains of ancient tent encampments, maybe some huts or things like that. So that's what that's based on. But you're right, it's very hard to identify or date, remains like tents or huts, in a landscape. So that's something that's not been accepted by everyone. And also, much more recently, my good colleague and friend Dennis Mitzi has argued that the caves in the limestone cliffs were not used at all for residences. He says that they're not suitable, that the finds that you have in them are not necessarily consistent, at least not with permanent occupation, maybe transitory but not permanent. So there's a whole mixture of things. My personal opinion is that nobody actually lived in the settlement. I don't think people lived or slept in it because of the animal bone deposits, I really do believe that the site functioned more as kind of a desert tabernacle. I think all sorts of things that cause impurity can happen when people are sleeping inside. And so in my opinion, whoever was at the site at any given time would have been staying, meaning sleeping, outside it in some of these maybe marl caves, maybe in tents and huts and like that, but I do think that the population would have fluctuated, and I actually think that DeVoe was correct in describing the site not as a settlement, but as a community center. That's his term for describing it. It's just very clunky to keep saying community center, but I think that's exactly what it was and that he was right in that.
So the sleeping over would be sacrificed.
Well, people didn't sleep inside the Jerusalem temple either. Right, no, exactly. So that's what I think now. Yeah, that's my thinking now. But again, I do think that the population fluctuated, and as you know, Geza Vermesh, for example, suggested that maybe at certain times for some of the festivals that they observed, members of the sect would congregate at the site. So I do think, I think that's not off in the sense that you have to...
They ate there.
Well, they ate there, yeah, but they ate in the temple also, exactly, right? So anyway, yes, exactly. That's my kind of line of thinking.
Good.
But thank you for asking that.
And a good answer.
Well, we had a toilet in Qumran, but then they have their own toilet practices. Then we can go into toilets if you want, but we can do a lot of toilet talk. But yeah, there was a toilet in the Jerusalem temple. It's interesting, but it was located on the northwest side of the. Yeah. Anyway, there's a whole.
And toilet in Qumran.
There was a toilet in Qumran.
According to the community, you have to go outside.
Right, but the toilet.
To do your toilet needs.
Not the rule of the community, the temple scroll.
The temple
right,
scroll.
but, and then Josephus, of course, describes them not going outside the, yeah, so anyway, I don't know if we want to go into the toilet, but.
Interesting questions, and obviously different points of view. I'm going to ask.
I don't think we're.
No. Yes, for a question.
Thank you. To Jody, thank you for your presentation again. about the animal sacrifices.
You see how controversial it is, right? Look at that, yeah.
We have the community rule, which is a sectarian text from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And on columns 9 and 10, we understand or we read that they see themselves, as you mentioned, as a holy living temple. And also they say that because of their sanctity or their pious works, they can atone for the sins. And explicitly they say without burnt offerings and sacrifices. So then and also you have the Psalm scroll from Cave 11 that also talks about the same idea. So then how do you reconcile your view with the textual evidence? I'm curious to hear about that.
So here I'm going to dodge your question. And the reason I'm going to dodge your question is because I can't remember offhand all of the different scrolls that I cite in my JAJ article, but if you go through, you will see that there are some scrolls which present the kind of picture that you are presenting, which has kind of supported the majority view until now. But you will see that there are other scrolls that actually can be interpreted exactly the opposite way. In other words, my point is that the evidence from the scrolls is not unequivocal, that you have some scrolls that seem to say one thing, some that seem to say another, and also, and here again, I'm an archaeologist, but also it depends on the context of when that particular scroll was composed and, you know, what it was addressed for. So it's a matter of how you interpret the scroll evidence. And that scroll evidence, I mean, again, Frank Cross dealt with this, right? So he cited scrolls too, but he cited scrolls that supported that view. So that's the problem with the scroll evidence.
I'd also like to say something about how we use the textual evidence when we talk about Qumran itself, because archaeology can show us what was actually happening there. And the problem with reading the text and then trying to interpret the archaeology is that's kind of backwards. And especially using the classical evidence of Josephus and Philo, so that when Josephus and Philo and Pliny all say that most Essenes, if not the majority, lived without the company of women. Well, so then you look at Qumran, and as Jody has pointed out, you don't find any material evidence for women and very little evidence in the cemeteries. So voila, right, you have a monastic community. The problem is that not all the scrolls say that they lived without women, right? The Damascus document and the rule of the congregation assume they had children and families. So you have a very mixed picture between the texts and the archaeology. And I think that the safest thing to do is to take the archaeological evidence as it stands for the site of Qumran and only secondarily look at the texts. So that's just kind of a way to think about how we think about those two really important bodies of evidence.
Before we go to the audience, Alex, you haven't had a chance.
I was going to say something else. I'm not an archaeologist, so you said you were. So I want to kind of second this notion. This is kind of how the scholarly process unfolds. And you know, as one of the editors of the Journal of Ancient Judaism, we kind of brought together a bunch of different contributions on this subject. And I'm going to tell you, every single person said the way that Jody interprets the data is absolutely correct, and I can't figure out how to make sense of all the other evidence, the contemporary Jewish evidence that seems to push against the idea of animal sacrifices outside of Jerusalem. So I think this is kind of part of the scholarly process where we put everything together. And what Sydney was saying a moment ago is that we talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls as if they're one single kind of collection. They're not one collection. They're not one single voice. You know, every text is really an anthology, just like the Bible. So there's space to kind of think about this broadly, and I just think a lot about the very first Dead Sea Scroll that was discovered, that Emmanuel mentioned, the Damascus document, was discovered 50 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Cairo Geniza by Solomon Schechter. And when he published it, he actually has these notes where he assumes that this unknown group that he calls Sadukites were doing animal sacrifice. So for him, without the archaeological data, the textual data was pointing, if he only had this one text. Now, if he had the rule of the community, if he had the other text, he would have, of course, said it's more complicated, it's more nuanced. But working from a single piece of textual data, he saw animal sacrifices, right? So I think we have to think about this in a kind of multidisciplinary approach, which is nice to have all this group up here. Very
helpful comments. We could obviously keep talking up here, but I know that many of you probably have questions. So raise your hand, and somebody will bring you a mic. And it would be nice if you addressed your question to a specific person, although it can be general. So where do we go? Okay, over here.
I just wonder what the difference in Christianity would be today if we didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay, so I'll start. I think that, and I'm going to talk about this tomorrow, I think that the main difference for Christianity really is what we've learned about the text of the Old Testament and how that's affected our Bible translations today. Otherwise, what we learn about Christianity, we don't learn anything about Christianity from the scrolls, right? We learn about the Jewish milieu out of which Christianity arose. And so we learn a lot more about the background and the thought, the thinking that was going on around people like Jesus and Paul, which is a little different than what we learn about Christianity, right? So I think Christianity would just have continued on, but it would have been a less rich and nuanced Christianity than what we have learned from the scrolls.
Thank you. Okay, back.
I was intrigued by the use of prisons in trying to see what a dining hall could accommodate. I was wondering if there's any look at like a mikveh bottleneck of like how many people could go through a mikveh in a day, and wondering if that would offer any additional insight into a population size.
How many people could go through a mikveh in a day? I don't know. I mean, I guess you could do some experimental archaeology and see. The interesting part of that question is, it's possible that not all the mikvahot were in use at one time, too, right? So it may be that they rotated them, and as one got too gross or the water got too low, maybe they would open up the next one, right? In general, as far as I know, you didn't have to spend very long in the mikveh, right? You basically had to immerse yourself fully, so the water was supposed to come into contact with all the parts of your body. You may have had to, like, said a blessing or something like that, but, I mean, it wasn't a prolonged process. So in theory, probably the whole community could cycle through in a day, but they weren't doing it like that. They were doing it on certain occasions. Like Josephus says, before they go in for their communal meal, they immerse in they immerse and purify themselves. So, they wouldn't have all been going in at the same time, or they would have, there would have been certain occasions or something, but it wasn't like daily you had people cycling through all day in the mikvah, right?
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Interesting question. There's from
online regarding the animal sacrifices. Is there more archaeological evidence, such as altars?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's actually one of the criticisms of my interpretation, which is, well, where's the altar, right? So there are no clear remains of an altar. Personally, I don't think not having an altar is a problem, because we know that, Qumran was destroyed in 68, and there was a reoccupation of the site by Roman soldiers after that, and so there was a lot of messing around done at the site. So if there was an altar, it wouldn't necessarily have survived. That said, I actually do think that the remains of an altar are visible, at least in DeVoe's notes, and I talk about this in my article. There's a space on the north side of the settlement, an open-air space, where you have a negative that's surrounded by ash, as kind of like a big square negative area, and it's clear that there was something there, and ash kind of accumulated against it, and it looks like whatever it was robbed out. And I suggest that, for various reasons, I suggest that that's where the altar was located. Jean-Baptiste Humbert, coincidentally, who's at the École, the archaeologist at the École, is kind of the successor, in a way, to DeVoe, also thinks there was an altar, but at a different place to the north of the site. So, yeah, I mean, there's no clear remains of an altar, but to my mind, that's not a deal breaker.
Regarding the relationship between, as Josephus said, the philosophies, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, how did those groups interact with each other? What were their opinions of each other?
Well, I will say, I'll preface my remarks by saying the following. Our knowledge about the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes is primarily from Josephus and some other Jewish writers and things like the New Testament. And then, of course, there's later rabbinic literature that talks about some of these groups, not the Essenes, but the Pharisees and Sadducees. Every single one of these bodies of literature has, for sake of simplicity, a very specific agenda in presenting these groups to their audiences. Josephus is describing Jewish culture and Jewish society for his Roman audience, trying to explain what this group was that had just been destroyed by the Romans, and trying to kind of, in many ways, ameliorate the status of the Jews among his Roman audience. The New Testament pits Jesus, in the storytelling, pits Jesus against the Pharisees, against the Sadducees to some extent. And rabbinic literature, the rabbis centuries later, imagine themselves as connected to the Pharisees in some way and sees the Sadducees as adversarial. So this is all to say that everything we know about these groups, it's conditioned through a prism of how people want to present these aspects of society. But even with all those caveats, we can tell some stories about how these groups interacted. They do seem to have some clear differences of opinion on things, differences of beliefs. The most famous one is Josephus tells us that the Essenes believe in fate, that everything is determined by fate, that the Sadducees believe that there is no fate, everything is based on your free will, and the Pharisees are in some sort of middle space between that. Now, even if Josephus is simplifying this for his audience, there's some kind of connection to the reality on the ground of these groups. Now, were they sitting in a room like we're doing here and having these debates? Probably not. I mean, I'd say maybe very much not so. But what comes out of when we kind of, as historians, carefully read all the literature about them, we can see that they present that. And then when you go to something like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's another piece of the data that points to the Essene identity, they seem to connect their vision of humanity and things like that with the way that the Essenes are described by Josephus, both in thought and in practice. And I think this is another kind of important piece, is that Josephus wants to talk about ideas, but he's less interested in describing to his readers what they did in practice. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are so carefully kind of interested in Jewish ritual and practice, about which we heard a lot, fill in some of those gaps that Josephus doesn't want to tell us about. And then we can kind of, as historians, figure out where this all fits together to get a unified picture of all these groups.
Last one is if you all would react or what your opinions are regarding Daniel Vainstub's proposal that Qumran was a annual pilgrimage site. Daniel Vainstub of Ben Gurion University.
No, I actually remember that. So, look, okay. No, it's not, I mean, okay, so there are a lot of different interpretations of Qumran. I can't actually remember every detail of what he wrote in that article. It's not I mean, it's actually, my reaction to it when it came out was, well, okay, what's new? I mean, in other words, to me, it was like, yeah, okay, so I mean, again, long ago, Geza Vermesh had already, who he does not cite, by the way, in his article, had suggested, in fact, something along those lines, that, you know, that members of this sect gathered together on certain festivals, you know, for you know, ritual purposes or whatever, right? So when I read the article, it was kind of like, yeah, okay, not a whole lot, you know, new here to see. My reaction is actually more not to that suggestion, but rather in general, there have been a lot of alternative interpretations of the archaeology of Qumran in recent years. And by the way, whenever anybody suggests any alternative interpretation of Qumran, it makes headlines. So it's always very sensational. Not this particular interpretation, but a lot of the other alternative interpretations are really pretty out there, in my opinion, because they divorce the Dead Sea Scrolls from the site of Qumran. So again, he doesn't do that, but a lot of them do that, and they come up with alternative interpretations that Qumran was something completely unconnected with the Dead Sea Scrolls, with the Essenes, with a sectarian community, and so you get that it's a villa or a manor house or a fort or a commercial entrepot or a pottery manufacturing center or something like that. And you know, those theories are really, in my opinion, completely unsustainable. So I mean, I don't have strong negative reactions to that. It was more just kind of like, oh yeah, okay, well, you know, it would have been nice if he had cited Geza Vermesh and said, well, actually, this is, you know, something that was suggested a long time ago by one of the world's premier Dead Sea Scrolls scholars, and, you know, maybe elaborated a bit on it. But anyway. So.
Okay. Question.
Hi, this is for Dr. Magnus. Regarding the pantry of the site at Qumran, you had made mention before that the estimate of the population had shifted from about 15 all the way to 150. It being an Essene aesthetic community, would 1,000 articles of pottery be typical for a site like that, or would that be an outlier? What were your thoughts on that?
No, it's a great question. And actually, the number of pottery dishes is what has led to that suggestion that Qumran was a pottery manufacturing center, which is really easy to disprove, but the large number of dishes is very interesting. Whether it was, let's say, 15 or whether it was 100, it's still a lot of pottery dishes, right? And that actually connects in with the purity thing. And this was already suggested also by Magain Broshi, right? He's the one who observed this. Because according to biblical law, pottery is a material that becomes impure when it comes into contact with something that's impure. So if a lizard crawls across your dish, the dish becomes impure and there's no way to purify it. You have to break it and you can't reuse it. And so the large number of dishes and the fact that they're manufacturing pottery at all at the site, which again is not a really suitable place for, you know, a pottery manufacturing workshop, does, in my opinion, show their concern with observing a high level of Jewish ritual purity. And to my mind, it also goes along with the function of the site, where again, I think you have these sacrifices, and part of the whole thing with sacrifices is that you then consume, you know, part of the sacrificial meat is burned on the altar, but the rest of it gets divided up and eaten on the spot. And then you would need, you know, to have those dishes. And that's also what you find in ancient sanctuaries. Then you find the remains of the sacrificial meals, including the pottery, disposed of on the grounds of the sanctuary.
Ancient religions followed a calendar. I was wondering what kind of calendar was being utilized, whether it was a solar calendar or a lunar calendar or some hybrid.
Jody handed me the microphone, so I guess that means I'm on.
You can hand it to somebody else.
Right. No, this is another question that kind of emanates out of the textual data. The solar calendar predominates in the text from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the sectarian documents. They're not unique in that sense. That is to say, there's already a preference for a solar calendar in various other literatures of ancient Judaism that we knew about before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and nobody really kind of paid much. It's not they didn't pay much attention to the text; they didn't pay much attention to the solar calendar. Then all of a sudden, you have this group that seems to have kind of its own self-sustained social movement that's advocating for a solar calendar as well. So that kind of gave a little bit more interest in this idea. what I think is most significant here is, how do you have a life of a solar calendar if you imagine yourself as part of a broader society that's following a different calendar, right? So, obviously sometimes this is inconsequential, right? Today is Veterans Day, and if somebody wanted to celebrate Veterans Day yesterday when it was, observed, it wouldn't make such a big deal, right? But imagine if, let's just take the example from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, according to the lunar calendar, that the priests in the temple at the time seemed to have been following, fell on one particular day, and the solar calendar has it fall on a different day. So all of a sudden you have two very different kind of social movements that make it very hard for these groups to coexist, and then you throw into that mix that each group feels like this is the divinely kind of ordained calendar, and it creates this contention. And this comes out in one of the texts that actually I'll talk about tomorrow, that Emmanuel mentioned, the Pesher on Habakkuk, where they tell a story. And personally, I think this is a story. I don't think this ever happened, but I think it's part of their rhetorical storytelling, where it's the Day of Atonement for the group in their settlement, and it's a regular, off day for the high priest in Jerusalem because they're following a different calendar. And the text describes how the wicked priest, this is a cipher which is used for the high priest, comes to their place of settlement to harass and persecute the teacher of righteousness in his community, which is celebrating the most solemn, holy day of the year, according to their calendar. Now, this may have happened, it may not have happened, but from the storytelling perspective of this community, they see these calendrical disputes as at the heart of this division between themselves, whom they see as the sons of light, the righteous, chosen remnant, that are ordained by God, and everybody else who's wrong, who, by the way, are in charge of the most important and powerful institutions in Jerusalem. So you can see how the kind of seeds are set just on what seems like an innocuous kind of disagreement about whether we follow the sun or the moon.
President has a question. Is that right?
It's a question for our Jordanian guest. Thank you for being with us today. I'm intrigued by the Andrews University connection and wondering what you're doing there, how you got involved. Secondly, in your family's history and folklore, I saw pictures of King Hussein and many big prominent figures from my childhood. How important was the Dead Sea Scrolls story in your family as compared to all of the other accomplishments of your father?
Well, you mean the story of my father?
How important was this Dead Sea Scroll story in your family? In your family?
In my family?
Yeah.
It's in my family, they always speak about it in a nice way, and they are so proud of my father. Mm-hmm. Because my father, he likes the history, and he likes always to search and find things about our area, about Jordan. And it's not a surprise, because when they dig in Tel Jalul, in his area, he donated 72 dunam, which is a huge area, to Department of Antiquities to start excavation and to find what inside this cell. It's for him. He is so happy, and our family, they are so proud of him, and what he always expressed and tell us about the story. When we are kids, we are so excited. Even his grandsons and granddaughters, they are so happy. This is what you mean, or?
Yes, excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, and the Andrews connection, how did you get to Andrews?
Actually, I finished my first degree in fine arts. Then I decided to finish my master's from Jordan University to go to archaeology. So my doctor told me, Sabal, if you want to write something about your thesis, why not to try to start with your Tal, the area your father owned. So in 1992 something, I went with my father, and he was just put me there and just Dr. Randy, she is like your daughter, take care of her, and he left. So this is what was the beginning, that I start to dig with them while I'm doing my master's degree. Later on, after many excavations, Dr. Randy told me, why not, Sabal, to try to study in our university and finish your studies. And to be honest, I was so happy, and that's why I have my baby. My son still was young, and he's a baby actually. And I left him for 4 months, something like this, and went to Andrews, and I took classes there, and I continue with the site. You know, I belong to this area, and I want to explore anything inside. I'll be so happy if I found something. And this is the story of what I can tell you about.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Really interesting. One more question.
So I have a question for Dr. Magnus about, you were mentioning about an earthquake and that there was all the damage from that earthquake. And so I was wondering, that was 31 BC, correct? So what was the magnitude of that earthquake? And then was that felt up in northern Israel? Would they have felt it up there, or was
31 BC, right?
31 BC,
yeah.
Is my understanding, right?
That's an interesting question. Actually, we don't know the magnitude of the earthquake, right? They didn't measure seismic earthquakes at that time. But thinking of it, you know, so the evidence for that earthquake is a reference in Josephus to a strong earthquake that hit the area of Jericho in the year 31 BC. And DeVoe was able to match the archaeological remains that he uncovered with the earthquake, you know, in the earthquake damage, and dated the earthquake damage to 31 BC. So a couple of things about this. So first of all, not everyone now agrees that the earthquake damage that you see in the archaeological remains at Qumran is the earthquake of 31, because it's the Afro-Syrian Rift, you know, the Rift Valley, there's earthquake activity, tectonic activity all the time, and so not everyone necessarily now agrees, not all archaeologists at least agree, that the earthquake damage that you see is, in fact, from the earthquake of 31. There are suggestions that it's an earthquake at a later date or whatever. So I will say that. I still think it's 31, but not everybody agrees. The second thing is, I can't think off the top of my head of any other site in the area where we have pretty secure evidence of that earthquake in archaeology. Off the top of my head, I can only think of Jason's tomb in Jerusalem, where there's a suggestion that it went out of use after the earthquake of 31. And if that's true, then it means that the earthquake would have also impacted Jerusalem. But off the top of my head, I can't think of other sites that have been excavated in Jerusalem where damage from that earthquake has been claimed to have been found. So I will also just say that in general, you know, identifying archaeological evidence of earthquake damage is hard. It's not always obvious that damage was necessarily caused by an earthquake. In my opinion, the damage that we see at Qumran is earthquake damage, but it's not always clear in archaeological sites. Well, you have the fissures that run through the site. You have the way that the dishes in the pantry collapsed, right? Actually, the really, in my mind, the clearest evidence of earthquake damage along the Afro-Syrian Rift Valley is the year 749 AD. There was a really strong earthquake that hit the Rift Valley. And if you look at sites going north from the Dead Sea to the area around the Sea of Galilee, you see sites that were basically leveled. The site of Hipposusita, which overlooks the Sea of Galilee, you see really classic evidence. You see a church where the rows of columns all collapsed in the same direction. When you have that, they all fell in the same direction, and that's caused by, yeah, I mean, really clear evidence. You even have human and animal victims that were caught in that earthquake at a site like Pella in Jordan, for example. I mean, all up and down that area. That's really clear. But a lot of other times, it's not really all that clear, and sometimes you can't necessarily connect it with a specific earthquake. So, but I still am a believer in the 31 BC at Qumran, but again, acknowledging that not all archaeologists necessarily accept that still. Here's part of the problem. So to my mind, and here I'm not talking about Qumran. Here I have in mind other sites, other earthquakes. So there's a tendency among many of my archaeological colleagues to look for references to earthquakes in historical sources, and we do have references in historical sources, mostly in the centuries AD, not so much BC, but also BC. But and to look for like references and say, oh, there's a reference to an earthquake that hit Israel, in the area of modern Israel, in 363 AD. And then what happens is archaeologists go to sites and they find what looks like a destruction level. Oh, this must be the earthquake of 363 AD. So I think that there's too much of a tendency on the part of some of my colleagues to automatically jump to the conclusion that a certain level is an earthquake of a certain date that they read about in the historical sources, right? So I think we have to be a little more careful about that, and that means that it's hard to ascertain exactly how big an area or whatever was affected by an earthquake, right? So the fact that an ancient source says that the earthquake was strong, well, how do you measure that? How do you measure the impact? It wouldn't have necessarily impacted every single place in the same way. I mean, you can go to places today where there's earthquakes, and you can have some buildings standing next to buildings that have collapsed, right? So it doesn't mean that just because there was an earthquake, everything was leveled in exactly the same way. It depends on the earthquake, depends on the ground, it depends on the building materials, all sorts of different things. And so it's really hard, for antiquity to try and answer these questions in a more, categorical way, right?
You can see that we have a very knowledgeable panel. We've got lots of good questions. Unfortunately, we've gotten the high sign that we're beyond our schedule, but while Dr. Clark comes forward, I want to thank the panelists for doing a great job. Thank you for the questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you all for a really lively discussion and a great afternoon. And I want to thank you, Sabal, for joining us. And I hope you get some rest because the sun is coming up in Amman in less than 2 hours. So be sure to get some good rest.